Hello, everyone. This is Khaja Hamad Akbar, and I welcome you to first session of Future Resources. And I'm a decolonization strategist at Future Resources, and it is our first session, and we are really excited to have you all with us. And I request everybody who has joined us, please raise your hand and introduce yourself so that we can start the formal conversation.
Hi, everyone. We're just waiting a couple of minutes for everyone to join. But in the meantime, feel free to introduce yourself here on the chat. Tell your name, where you're from. If you want to leave your LinkedIn link as well, that would be great. Today, we have with us two amazing guest speakers. We're going to introduce them in just a minute. So get introduction started on the chat, please. I would like to ask the Future Resources team to introduce themselves. So if you guys can each open the camera, introduce yourselves, please, and then we're going to move on to introduction of the guest speakers.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pedro. I'm from Brazil. I'm currently working as an innovation strategist here at Future Resources. I'm also work as an innovation consultant at an IT company here in Brazil also. Nice to meet you all.
Hi, everybody. I'm Luciana. I work with the Future Resources team. I help with research and curatorship and also institutional content as a writer for our digital channels. And I'm a multidisciplinary consultant, bilingual consultant in operations, research, and content, which actually involves a lot of stuff, but I'll just leave my LinkedIn link here for everybody who's interested in chatting and continuing after our session today.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on our first ever live session. I'm Victoria Oliveira. I come from a content background, but joined as a content strategist and content creator here at Future Resources. And I also work doing some trend research as a freelancer.
Kaja, do you want to introduce yourself again quickly?
Sure. This is Khaja Hamad Akbar. I'm from Pakistan, currently living in Islamabad, and I'm a decolonization strategist at Future Resources. It's been 2 months, and I'm really excited to be part of this wonderful people, full of energy, and we look forward to having a successful session today.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So just a quick recap for the people who might not know exactly what Future Resources is, what Future Resources does. So we are a project. We are a passion project. We started 4 years ago. We started online basically by putting lists of resources of all types, podcasts, books, articles, classes, etc. Just putting them online and available for anyone who wanted to learn a little bit what the basics of foresight is. And then we have been evolving since then. We have a WhatsApp community where we do a curation of daily futures related content. We have a monthly newsletter. We're now doing these amazing sessions. Hopefully this is the first of many to come. And myself, I'll just quickly introduce myself as well. I am Lydia Caldana. Maybe some of you know me. I am a foresight strategist. I'm also from Brazil, but have been living in different continents for a long time. I'm currently based in Lisbon, Portugal, and very open to doing online coffee chats and meetups or in person. Also, if you ever come to Lisbon, please let me know. And thank you so much for being here. But special thanks to our dear guest speakers. I think some of you may know Sandra from our Future Resources October takeover that we had last year. She was one of the guest takeovers during that kind of session we had. And then we have, of course, Marite as well. So instead of me trying to introduce you, I think it's better that you introduce yourselves. You'll do a much better job at that. So if each of you could please talk about yourselves, a little bit about your background, how you fell into Futures work, what segment of Futures work you work with. Anyway, anything that you would like to share. And just one more message. We are sending instructions for all the participants to turn on the captions in your preferred language here on the chat. So if you have difficulty understanding English, please turn on the captions. You can translate them into whatever language you like, okay? Thank you, Sandra. Marite, over to you.
Should I go first? I was going to say you go. Okay, I'll start. Fantastic. Very excited to be back here. Like I told Lydia, anything that has to do with future resources, I'm joining. So very excited. A little bit about my background. I'm Peruvian. I'm from Lima, born and raised. And I was trained as a fashion designer. I think a lot of people that wanted to work in fashion from my generation. I'm 34, so I think that most of us didn't have any options, basically. It was either fashion design or something else. So I started studying in my hometown in Lima, and I always say that I fell in love with research very early on. I always loved the research aspect of the creative process the most, but I had no idea that I could actually just devote my whole work to research. So it was later on when I moved to New York, I continued my studies at FIT at the Fashion Institute of Technology, also in fashion design. But that's when I was actually properly introduced to the field of trend forecasting. Fascinated by it. I was like, okay, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. So I was very lucky to get a position at Fashion Snoops, which for the ones that work in fashion, I'm sure you know the name. For the ones that don't, please Google it. It's a really cool trend forecasting agency. And I worked for them for a few years, first in New York, then back in Lima. But there was always this, or at the beginning, maybe not that obvious, but then I started to question a lot of the things that we were researching there, because basically we were not talking about Latin American fashion. We only had 2 cities that we were covering when it came to fashion trends, which were in Brazil. I'm sure everyone kind of like guesses which ones there are, Sao Paulo and Rio. But I knew that there was more there. So I started kind of like questioning this discourse that Latin America is only related to tropicalism and to bathing suits, and that we are quote unquote behind. That's when I decided to leave that job. I got another design job back in Lima. I hated it, to be honest. But I basically realized that there was a huge gap between creating, researching, I guess, the reports that I was or doing the research for the reports when I was at Fashion Snoops, and then what the people in the company were actually doing. Obviously, I was one of those people, but I ended up taking that almost 2 years at the company as a sort of immersion to see how I could improve the experience of the employers or the employees of that company and how to use those reports. So in those almost 2 years, I realized that I needed more research methodology, and that's when I moved to Paris. I'm currently based in Paris. I've been here for 6 years. I came to get my MA degree in fashion studies at Parsons, and that also switched again my career because I completely fell in love with academia. It's crazy to think that I didn't know that you could actually do academic research in fashion, but actually I didn't know. So that opened my eyes to the many possibilities. And I started teaching, and I started being able to understand a lot of my questions from my time in the industry through theory. Obviously, decoloniality came into my work, and I was like, okay, this is all making sense. So by the time I graduated almost 5 years ago, I decided to, same as Lydia, you were explaining, I mean, we have to basically create our own work. And I decided to basically have two separate, well, actually they combine each other. They basically talk to each other, I guess, the two sides of my career, but I decided to focus both in my academic work. So I continue teaching, researching, obviously everything that has to do with that. So presenting on conferences, writing papers, etc. And then I decided to start working as an independent consultant with Latin American companies. I have worked with other companies here in Europe, but my focus is on Latin American companies. Yeah, basically my whole focus, or my aim, my motivation behind that work is trying to decolonize our minds and our thoughts, and rethink the fashion system in a way that we can create sustainable businesses, and that we are not constantly in a rush to copy everything that is happening in the case of fashion, for example, Paris or London or Milan or New York. So yes, I think that's a summary.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Marite?
Yes, thank you so much, Lydia. And thank you again, Future Resources, and everybody here. Hello, it's so lovely to be in this nice, cozy conversation. Sandra, super fascinating story. So, okay, where I didn't rehearse this, so bear with me. But hello, I'm Marite. I am actually from the Philippines, but I am currently calling you from a very wet day in England. I want to consider myself, I guess, a global citizen because from 2008, I've actually lived outside the Philippines. So it says a little about my age. Let's just say I'm a Gen Xer. I'm probably the oldest in the room. I was work from home before work from home became trendy, because of the way my life has been. So I'm married to a British man, and his job took us around the world. So I've always had a quote unquote portable career, but I spent a whole decade really in advertising, and those are my roots. It's really in doing consumer research, market research, but at the same time linking that to strategy and innovation. So within the world of advertising and marketing, if you guys are familiar, there is a whole discipline called strategic planning. So that's essentially where I grew up. But prior to even entering work, I want to say that I've always been hyper curious about people and just the world at large and the human condition and all the things that make us interesting as human beings and the environment. So maybe a little bit of context. I grew up in the Philippines at a time when there was a change in government from a big dictator, a 20-year dictator, into really a much more democratic system of government. And, at a very young age, we were out in the streets and really fighting for these freedoms. So I think if anybody were to sort of like do an autopsy of of my soul, at the heart of it is I am a social justice warrior, which is why my my roots in advertising are a little bit contrary to who I think I am. And so when I finally got out of the Philippines, it made me really think about I've gathered all of these skills in doing trends research. So I was working with McCann, Erickson, Leo Burnett. These are international names, Publicis. And one of the things we did there was constantly trend spotting because, it was all about how do you feel, how do you feed consumption behavior. But I realized as I was doing a lot of ethnographic research and really doing a lot of immersive research that the job was really all about problem solving, but also was all about understanding people's aspirations, right? And hopes and dreams and fears. Um, and that's when I realized that all of this, all these strategic tools, and this is how I see futures thinking, not so much as, I mean, it is an area of discipline, it is a practice, but for me, more and more, it really is a powerful tool. And it's just one of an arsenal of tools that I think I have as a strategist. And this is where I did really come into the realization that a lot of the strategic planning tools that we use are very much geared towards short-term thinking, right? So it's all about, because that was the demand of the client, which is how can you increase sales by X% in the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years maximum. And so I see ditto. Yeah. And so, we'd often go into these conversations and say, yes, but what is your long-term vision? And you oftentimes we're met with a lot of like blank faces. So what's so nice is that in the last, I would say, decade, is there's just been this resurgence on purpose, right? And the meaning of what is it that we do? How can we make our work meaningful? How can we bring purpose into the boardroom, into the business? And that's when I realized how using trends, using forward thinking, can really help shape bringing purpose into business and really driving not just sales, not just business, but also mission forward. And so in 2018, I want to say this is just before, pre-pandemic, 2018, 2019, I kind of had my crisis of conscience. So up until that point, I was working as solely as a brand strategist, I want to say. But it's also when I started discovering all these innovation tools, So I was using design thinking way back in 2015, but I was opened up to experience design. I was opened up to futures design. And this is how I found myself now, which is really, putting more and more of my work towards strategic foresight and futures thinking. So what am I today? So I kind of think of us human beings as we're constantly iterating, and my version X.0 is I like to say, I'm a foresight strategist, I'm a futures designer, but really at the end of the day, what I am is, at my heart of hearts, is a strategist, right? So I go, and my client base will be private sector, NGOs, and institutions. And my way in to really talk futures is through strategic planning. So I think one of the things that I've found really useful is to really get just people into conversation about what their problems are, right? What are the problems that they're seeing in the environments that they're in? So I've worked with the academe, and you're seeing more and more that the academe is threatened by, or feeling not so much threatened, but challenged by AI, and all of these technologies. I work with NGOs where they're seeing that there is such an acceleration of the problems of the world. How can we keep up? You're working also obviously with corporates, right? And it's all about, oh my gosh, it's the next thing. It's always so fast. And everyone feels like, we have this quote in the marketing space, like everyone is a hyper marketer, right? So you're constantly running. And I think I come into this space sort of just to say, let's breathe a little. Let's just set aside. I usually say, just give me some time, give me 3 days to just think about where we are at the moment and where we could be headed. And that's how I start to bring in futures tools. But it's never a hard sell, like, let's bring in futures thinking. No, it's never really like that, because I think it can scare people off. But it's certainly bringing people into a conversation about, have you thought about widening your lens a little bit? Looking at the longer view. So, in that sense, I think my trajectory in my career has really been, there has been one through line, I want to say, which is really thinking about thinking, right? I think that's what strategists do. We constantly think about thinking. We think about how can we bring a different frame to a problem that's in front of us. The frame might be in the form of creative, it might be in the form of fashion or design or architecture, and it can be in the form of time, thinking about the future, thinking about in terms of finance or economics. And this is why I love this space, because it brings all of that together, right? The interdisciplinary nature. So I mean, that's sort of like the through line of my work, but what's evolved is the kinds of people that I work with, and maybe guided by my own compass of how can I use the skills that I do to actually help bring people towards the light. Not that it's not messianic in any way, shape, or form, because we all have to earn a living and we all have to, we all are doing our best. But it's certainly, I think, a good time to start getting into conversation, because people are thinking about it, right? Like, how can the work that I do actually contribute to something bigger than myself or to something good? And futures, because of the fact that it asks you to think beyond 5 years, 10 years beyond, it suddenly raises bigger questions. And we'll talk about this later, but the beauty of futures is the fact that because you put time into thinking about longer term futures, you suddenly open up possibilities and horizons. So that's me. Recent projects I've worked on, I've worked, just to land this whole conversation on how it can be practiced. I have worked, my most recent super exciting project was working with the biggest real estate land developers in the Philippines on thinking about the future of cities, thinking about what is the shape of central business districts in countries where things are evolving, workforce is evolving. I've also recently been working with one of the top universities. So a lot of my work is still in the Philippines, because it's where my heart is and my family, and it's also where a lot of problems are. So, like, for example, today, if any of you are in the Philippines out there, but maybe not, but I'm thinking of them because we have big floods that have just struck the country. But so I've also used it in academia, so working with a school of education to think about what is the future of education. At the same time, I've worked at advertising agencies, thinking about what's the future of creativity in the world of AI and generative AI, as well as with an NGO in women's health. So I would really just like to land this in that space of what Lydia and team are doing, which is really all about democratizing and decolonizing futures. I think these terms are huge, and they're new, right? And I am still learning about it, but certainly I think it's such an important conversation to have, because a lot of the ways that we have all been educated, a lot of the ways by which we attack or we approach business and our work has been through, I think, and you can, we can have a conversation around this, around through Western frameworks. And what's wonderful is that now there is this awakening to how each of our identities and cultures and ways of thinking and doing, indigeneity, is suddenly now part of the conversation. So I'm glad that we're all here, and happy to answer any questions that you guys might have. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, just a reminder for everyone who might have missed the introduction. This is an open conversation. The idea is to get to know how futures people work, how they get into futures, and kind of answer some of the questions that everyone might have, or learn some curiosities, what it's like doing futures work in the Philippines, or what it's like being a Latin American woman in futures, etc. So feel free to send questions in the chat. We'll answer them later on. Right now, we're getting to know our amazing guest speakers. And on that note, I would like to ask Sandra, what would you say is the best part of your professional day, or what are some types of projects that you get really excited by?
I love this question. Um, Okay, I'm gonna try to organize my thoughts. There's a lot here. So I think that one of the best parts of the work that I do is actually, well, I know this obviously, that whenever we talk about trends, it's not just about the next trend, the one that's coming next season or whatever, you know. I think that in the fashion industry, and I would say any industry that works with trends is very short-sighted. You know, it's like we need a report for the collection that is coming in the next 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year. And each one of those trends became popular because of something that is happening in society and in culture. And for me, making my clients realize that there's something behind the popularity of a specific trend is one of the most fantastic things that I can do. Because so I think I have to go back, because initially when I started working in this independently, I thought that I would go toward entrepreneurs or small business owners. But unfortunately, even though I try to create spaces for those kinds of businesses, most of them just rely on, or not just, they rely on other resources that are free resources or cheaper resources. I have created some short courses to be able to open that knowledge to them, but most of the time they're mostly focused on setting up the business. So I've ended up working with big companies, which I never thought that would happen. But the thing with working with big companies, I think we already see a pattern here, is that sometimes they're very close-minded. They're very set on their ways. So every time, I think my favorite kind of project is the trend workshop, or I like to call them trend 101 workshops. So it's basically, I usually organize it in like 4 to 6 sessions, to give them some tools and methodology to organize their trend research process. And I always start with history. I always start with some, depending on the company, I bring in different ideas. Like I said, I work mostly with Latin American companies. So I always talk about decoloniality. I always talk about this idea of the West versus the rest. So I bring in hard theory. Obviously, I try to make it as digestible as possible, but I've had a very good response every time I do that. So I think that opening their eyes to that and to realizing, oh, actually, I'm not supposed to be chasing the next trend that, I don't know, Chanel is doing in Paris, but actually figuring out what works for my market is great. And then on a personal side, just what I like to observe is basically that what becomes popular in different places because of what is happening in culture. I think that is just fascinating. One of the most common questions that I get whenever I say what I do, because I think it's very hard. I mean, I like to define myself as a trend and fashion researcher. But I think even with that, there's still a lot of misunderstandings, and everyone usually asks the question, oh, what's coming up next season? What's coming up in the next few months? And I'm like, that's not what interests me. What interests me is how culture is going to influence whatever you end up wearing. Because I don't know, color is one of the topics that I think is very tricky to work with. It's not about yellow being the color of the year. It's about what is happening around ourselves that makes us more attracted to specific color. So I think that the most exciting part is observing culture through fashion and making people realize that there's more to trends than just downloading a report or reading a quick article that lists 5 trends for the next season, because that's a very superficial way of working with that.
Very, very much agreed. Yes. How about you, Marite? What would you say is your favorite part about your day when you're working with futures, or your favorite part of a project?
Yeah. For me, it's similar, right? So I think I do also a lot of research on the cultural side. So, they say if you work in the field of strategy, they often say culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I do think that's true. But that being said, beyond that, I love the workshops. I love the futures labs. For me, this is where I think the power of futures thinking and futures and foresight really comes to the fore is when you bring it to an audience and it becomes participatory, right? So one of the special things about this space is, I think, is how it is actually a very reflective practice. Like it asks you to go inwards first before you go outwards. So my favorite parts of workshops, of which there are many, is first is when we think about debiasing, right? So that's where decolonizing comes in as well. And then that classic question of asking who's not in the room, right? Who are we actually not thinking about when we start to think about projecting trends and envisioning futures? And I love that because that conversation or that question immediately gets people asking questions and talking about things. And it also puts people thinking about the future in a space of humility, right? So it tells us that, who am I not seeing in this room? Who should be here but isn't here? Who is not represented? So that's one is I love it when I get into a room and I don't really like to say I mean it is I am a facilitator, but I'm part of the experience as well, which is really confronting our assumptions about the future. That's one. The other thing I love is the creative aspect of futures. I think it's, the imagination part. One of my favorite lines is, we cannot build what we cannot imagine. And that's truly been such an inspiration to me. And part of the reason why I fell into this space is because oftentimes in places like in the global south, especially, that's poverty ridden, people are just thinking about how to feed themselves. So they can't think further. A lot of the time people say, oh, there is also poverty of imagination, right? Um, but the funny part is, I used to say that. I used to say, I want to be able to fight poverty, this whole poverty of imagination. But then when you do go and talk to people, everyone has a dream. Like even the poor, sorry to say this, but I mean, I don't know if it's politically correct, but the poorest of the poor, right? Even they have dreams for their families and for themselves. So I don't think it's a poverty of imagination. I think it's just having the space to imagine, right? Giving people permission to dream. And that for me is where the magic of futures design comes in again, and futures thinking and whatever you want to call it. But these workshops allow people to start to think about scenarios. If this is what we're seeing coming at us, how does that impact our lives in the next 10 years? And imagine, and the play aspect of futures is what really to me puts a smile on my face. So I think it's you can't I think use it as a tool and not use it creatively and with this with that spirit of play. So those are just two of many, many, many things which I do love about it.
Amazing. If I can have a follow-up question to that, Marite, because yeah, so would you say that there is or that there isn't a crisis of imagination right now? And
Yeah.
also maybe somewhat linked to that, which you also touched upon earlier before, which was people get a bit scared when you come and try to sell futures straight away. So we might use different language, different terms, whatever. There will be futures in the work, but sometimes we don't necessarily say it. So what do you think first about this crisis of imagination? What's going on? And is it somehow linked to this fear of the future? What is driving this fear of the future?
Yeah. Super good questions, Lydia. I'll try to keep it short because I'd love to hear also from Sandra. But okay, my learning personally, and I've only arrived at this, to be honest, in recent times. I don't think there is a poverty of imagination. I do, however, think that there is a poverty of exposure, openness, right? So why do I say that? I recently did foresight work with educators. These are teachers, right? So teachers who are meant to be consumers of knowledge and wisdom and information, but even they said, oh, I wish we knew more about what was happening out there. So, Marita, thank you so much for bringing us these trends and these signals of change, because it opens our eyes to what we are not seeing. So I think imagination also comes when we feed it. And some of the time I sense that it's not that people cannot imagine, it's just that they need more of the stimulus to get their imagination going, right? Because I also as you can probably tell, I'm a little bit of an optimist and pro-human, meaning to say I think we're born with that ability to create and to imagine, but I think you have to feed it. So I think it's poverty of feeding the imagination. And the way the world is going, where we are all in our bubbles, whether that's the algorithmic way of social media, or whether it's this polarization, it's putting us more and more into these silos and bubbles that really doesn't open us up to a more expansive worldview. And I think when you expand your worldview, when you expand your sources of information, you also expand your imagination. So that's the answer to that question. On futures, obviously there is a cognitive bias towards short-termism for us, right? As people in general, it's really scary. But I think, to be honest, futures thinking is a conversation. It doesn't happen in one go. When you are trying, for example, to win a client over or to win a team over, the way I've done it is really through, you know, have you thought about looking at it this way? Right? It's like, hey, I'm picking up this trend and it's telling me that it could actually have an impact on your business or the way we are designing a certain system in the office. Should we be exploring this? Should we be taking a look at this and other things as well? So it's opening the door slowly, and it's when they say in futures thinking, in world building, you have to ease people into it, right? It's like it's like an amusement park, and this is where my experience design comes in, is you have to slowly get people to enter and then immerse in it. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Sandra, would you like to also give your 2 cents here on these 2 questions?
I don't know if there's a lot to add because I completely agree with Marite. I mean, yeah, I'll just add 2 very quick things. For the first question, I also think that it's this problem of just being put into these very little boxes, and I think that there's this fear of perfection. You cannot make a mistake. So I think that when you are limited by that, you are kind of like limited to dream or to explore more things. And then on the other question, I guess just agree, because the thing, and specifically in my field, I bring in all of this idea in a very digestible way, because people hire me usually to help them figure out how to increase their sales, because they want to use trends as a way to improve their creative process, and the end goal is basically to increase sales. They don't want probably this girl coming here and telling them, you know what, let's think about power relations between the global north and the global south. So that's why I always include this kind of like history lesson. I always obviously include it in my proposal, but I go very deep in that, and then depending on the response that I get, I change the type of words, the terminology that I use in the next session. But I think, yes, I think you need to know your audience. If you know that they like numbers, you need to go with the numbers. If you know that they like whatever they like, you need, I think, just to finalize this, you need to know your audience as a way to adapt whatever you want to share with them and whatever you want to get from them. So it's being very strategic.
Yep. Amazing. And how about some challenges? Because working with futures is not always easy. So I would love to hear from both of you. What are some of the challenges that you've had to overcome in this many years, decades that you have been working with futures or trying to work with futures, or once you were there in the middle of a project, what are some challenges you find with the clients? All aspects of it. Can you tell us a little bit about the challenges you face?
Marite, do you
Oh,
so that I'm not taking over, I mean watching between who
oh,
answers. Because I answered the last one. If you want to go first.
okay. To me, challenge, oof, a lot. No, but I think, well, obviously on the business side of it, I think it is a challenge to actually get clients, to be honest, to buy into this work. Why? Because it's not cheap. It doesn't come cheap. And it doesn't come cheap because it takes time. At least my practice, right? Because I'm not in the field necessarily of trends research. I it's part of the work I do, but my output is really research for strategy. So that's a challenge, is the sell of it. And making it palatable to your clients. When I'm actually there and I'm doing the work, I think one of the biggest challenges for me is time. And that's the paradox. Like futures is all about time, but you do need to take time. Why? Because the the method of doing foresight is actually, they say the process is the journey. The process is the journey's in the process, or the process is the journey. But the idea that the work is actually not in the final report, it's actually in the conversation. So it's managing how you can make enough time and room for people to discuss. So I can imagine, for example, Sandra, if you bring a perspective on the history of fashion or history of culture, you need time to digest that, and to talk about it. So that to me is the challenge. I think is making room for that, given that people can only give you so little of their time, because everyone is so busy. And the final to me is, I think, where the facilitator comes in, which is, when we think of scenarios, right? In futures, that's one of the products of futures, thinking, is really thinking of scenarios, is how to keep pushing, how to challenge people, and how to provoke, and for that provocation to be taken positively, right, as a form of inspiration for ideas. So sometimes that stretching of the mind can also be honestly a challenge.
Yeah, I agree. I would also say, on my work, also getting clients. Um, I think in my case, like I mentioned at the beginning, I have an interdisciplinary background, an interdisciplinary career, I guess you could call it. So I have my half, which is my academic work, and the other half, which is consultancy. Um, so there's times when I don't have any consultancy projects, but I have my teaching jobs. So that helps me keep going. And I think I never thought about it in that way when I decided to approach my career or focus my career on those two aspects. But I think it's worked really great. Because obviously we want to make a living doing this. So I never thought finding clients, I think, would be this hard, because at one point I started reaching out. I actually had a huge spreadsheet with a lot of contacts from a lot of people, and I was reaching out to them, and I realized that that was not the right strategy, because when I reach out to them and I present to them my services, they tell me, we already have this. We already have access to so and so platform. So they don't see the added value that I can bring to them. So what I need to do is, in Spanish, at least in Peru, we use this phrase, which is trabajo de hormiga, which is like ant work. I don't know if that makes sense in other languages. So that's why I use Instagram. That's why I post a lot. I've been posting a lot more on LinkedIn, because my big clients, the ones that are staying with me, are the ones that reached out to me through the work that they saw my work on Instagram, or they saw my work on LinkedIn, and then they reached out, and that's how I started to build my client base. But I realized that if I present them to them, it's like, okay, you're just one more out of the, I don't know how many people we think are doing the same thing, which is obviously not true because I bring a very specific perspective into it. And I would say a second thing is imposter syndrome. I think that's a huge one. And especially because I've ended up working with big companies. And I mean, obviously, I know I have the experience. I know I've done the work. I know I'm not just getting started, but I've ended up having to sell my services or present my services to mostly men over 50. So 30-something-year-old girl with a face that looks like I'm, I don't know, 25, not to say that I'm younger, but I know that I have kind of like this like baby face. It's really hard. It's really hard to actually believe that I mean, I know that I know the work, but being in front of these people that sometimes could be my dad, I get very intimidated. So imposter syndrome is a huge thing. And I think that just to give something, because it's not just imposter syndrome and that's it, and then it's over. I think that I try to rely on just my work, you know, it's like I make always a structure. I go back to my methodology, I go back to the theory, I go back to my case studies, I go back to my past class. And I just try to think, this is something that actually my cousin told me, that they're probably reaching out to me because they want a new perspective. So she was like, yeah, they might be older than you. They could be your dad, but they actually want your perspective. So I try to also think about that and also obviously keep pushing my own work.
Amazing. Okay, I think we have some questions here from people. So let me pull them up. Okay, so Victoria wants to know what is your futures design process like? Can you, and I know it varies according to projects or everything, but more or less, what would you say are the key phases or elements when you are doing futures design?
Okay, I can jump in quickly. So for me, it's a 4 or 5 step process. The first is I always start with debiasing. So always starting with um unraveling assumptions about the future. I think it's always, to me, it's going into the whole process, understanding that you come in with a certain frame or worldview or story or narrative, and it's important to be able to acknowledge that. Um, and then, of course, I think it's super important to bring in, the signals of change, right? And understanding what it is that is coming at us, and then going into a process of really identifying which of these signals um, present the most uncertainty and also can have the most impact to our business. And then once you identify that, it's then really going into a process of coming up with scenarios or prototypes. It depends on what field you're working in. So, for example, in the design field, it's very much about thinking of artifacts. In the UX UI space, for example, it's really thinking of, how could we create scenarios around future experiences or future technologies. In the space that I'm sometimes in, which is development, institutions, strategy, it's thinking about what are the bigger contexts that we might be facing, and then backcasting. So backcasting is one of the tools in futures where we think about how to move forward from today by working backwards from the future. I don't know if that makes sense. So that's a general way by which I would approach futures design.
How about
And
you, Sandra? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, but I just wanted to point to this point of Victor, right? Which is, at the end of the day, it has to exactly be, I think for me, multidisciplinary, multi-perspective. Again, the whole different stakeholders in the room looking at the problem or focus space in different ways is always much more generative.
Sandra,
Okay.
you want to
Okay.
talk about the process? Yeah.
Well, in my case, since it's very applied, I would say, so the first thing is knowing that there's not just one way for fashion to evolve, in the sense that we are in a system that believes that there's only one future when it comes to trends. Meaning, for example, right now everyone's talking about the future of fashion is digital. It might not be, because there are parts of the world where that will probably not happen, or that will not happen soon. So in the same way, when we're talking about just the different trends, it's again going back to the local context. And then it's also one of the things that I always focus on, because this is something that for some reason every client that I've worked with has an issue with. It's always focusing, which comes back to focusing on the local context, is actually defining a buyer persona. Because I don't know why, to be honest, so many fashion companies are not, I mean, I guess that in that rush to follow trends, they forget that it's not a straight line, but it has to do with many different factors. And they usually forget to define or to figure out who their buyer persona is. So I always go back to that. So it seems very simple, but for some reason, most companies do not rely on that when trying to figure out how to move forward with a specific trend. And another thing that when focusing on the buyer persona and when focusing on these different routes, I guess, that a trend can take, it's also about having them look back at their processes and figure out what worked and what didn't, because usually you can find the connection, in the sense that I recently, one of my clients, they were sharing which collections were actually commercially successful. And they pinpointed it was a quiet collection focused more on this quiet luxury theme. And before that, it was the very 2021, 2022 post-COVID athleisure trend, which was this more comfortable approach to dressing. So with that, you can see that even though there's two separate quote unquote themes, it's actually the same buyer persona. It's someone that wants to dress comfortably, and that is probably, I mean, obviously you can change your style, but you can see the line there. One of the other examples that they shared with me is they wanted to do a collection, or they did actually 3 collections based on or surrounding sustainability. Obviously, their sustainability efforts are there, but they wanted to create a full theme around sustainability. And they realized that their customers are actually not interested in those kinds of discourses. So it's also about figuring out how to move forward with what they think makes sense for the future of their company, their future of whatever they are producing, but packaging it or framing it in a way that makes sense for their buyer persona. So I think that I don't know if this is making any sense, but I would say it's always going back to a buyer persona and figuring or realizing that there's not just one possible trend, one possible future, but there are many possibilities that sometimes do not even have anything to do to what companies are talking about in the traditional for fashion capitals. I don't know if that makes sense. It's hard to explain sometimes.
It does. Amazing. Before we jump on the next question, I would like to invite everyone here, all the participants, to turn on their camera, and we can take a little picture of everyone here just to register, post it later on Instagram if you are comfortable. If you're not, that's totally fine as well. But if everyone can and would like to, lovely to see your faces. Awesome. And yeah, just like I said on the chat, we are going to answer all the questions later, so keep them coming. Marite and Sandra we'll have a lot of homework, of a lot of questions to answer, but I think it's great. Please feel free to be honest and ask. I think this is the opportunity to understand the reality behind this profession that is new, it's interesting, but as you heard, it's also a bit challenging at times. So we can only benefit from exchanging information like this in a very honest way. So thank you all for being here. Okay, let's take another picture now. So let me count to 3. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, great. Done. Okay, great. Perfect. Feel free to close your cameras if you like. Let's go to the next question. I think it is, I'm losing. Okay, I think it's Giovanna's. So I would like to ask Marite if it's possible to build, but I think this goes for Sandra as well. And I know, Marite, you have answered it on the comment. I think it goes for both of you. How can you build a futurist career focused on some area of social and sustainability impact? And how do you do that? How do you build this career?
Yeah, I'll quickly jump in again. It's 100%. You can 100% build a career in that space. Um, so actually, I do work with a development space. So you're talking like, for example, now we have a project with World WWF. I've done work with NGOs as well. They are actually already using foresight. So, for example, groups like Save the Children, they have been using strategic foresight for over a decade now, and that's part of the futures thinking space. I think, if anything, the space of sustainability is where foresight is most at home, because it is about thinking about the future and long termism, right? Sustainability is all about the long term. How can you get into this space depends on where you want to reside within the space, right? So you have, for example, those who are in the program management, you have those who are in the strategic area, and then of course you have those who are in the communications area. So I think all of these will benefit from a futures lens. But by and large, the way I see it being used, at least for me, and this is my own experience, is through thinking about program strategies and thinking about solution strategies, innovations, right? So when you're talking about the environment, for example, like today, I was in a conversation on resilience, climate resilience because of the floods, and they use a lot of scenario building to think about what might happen if multi hazards come in. In fact, the person I was speaking with was in a conversation with people in architecture, and they were able to use that session to activate it now. So I see the time, but I'm happy to get into discussion separately on this. But yes, 100%.
Amazing. Sandra, do you have any tips here on how someone can focus their futures work specifically on impact?
We're limited on time, right? I'm gonna try to make it short. But I agree with Marite that it's 100% possible, and I will go back to one of the things that I said before, is that you need to know who you're speaking to. You need to know your audience, and you need to kind of like mold it to adapt to the company that you're working with, to the client that you're working with, because it is possible, even if it seems impossible, I think it's possible, because like we said, I think this is something that we've been mentioning throughout this time together. People are scared of the future terminology. They are scared of the word decoloniality. But if you bring those ideas in a way that makes sense to the people that you're working with, you will get the message there. It's just that sometimes you need to do it in a different way than you initially thought you would have to do that, even if you're working for a different kind of company. For example, when it comes to trend forecasting, WGSN it's already trying to introduce some of these ideas. I don't know what it's like introducing those ideas from the inside, but as someone that uses the platform, I see that there's kind of like, we start seeing those things emerge, even if a company as big as that one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I also agree, actually. I find that as a consultant, I have to keep adapting and dancing with the client, understanding their language, understanding oh, this is a sensitive topic for them, so maybe I need to approach it with a different perspective, or I need to use this term and not this term, etc. So it's a lot of adaptability, which makes us excellent professionals, I think. So thank you so much, Marite, Sandra, for being here. Thank you for the Future Resources team for being here and everyone who participated. We're gonna answer your questions, and also you guys are free to contact Marite and Sandra directly as well, I believe, and keep the conversations going. So thank you so much. If you want to give us your feedback on the form, that would be lovely. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Ciao.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.